How's it going, guys, and welcome to 4Mile Ranch. Today I wanted to share with you one of the most interesting optics that I've got to play around with to date, and that is going to be the INFITAC Fast. So obviously some rebranding in the name there, but this is their holographic fusion sight, and as the name suggests, it basically integrates a red dot style optic with a thermal optic. So you can use just the thermal, just the red dot, or both literally fused together. So it's pretty interesting. I'm going to get into it in detail, but before I do, I want to disclose that INFITAC did reach out to me and offered to send this my way. I do get to keep this optic, so there may be some update videos to come in the future, but for transparency purposes, I wanted to disclose the relationship there. And that is that they contacted me to share the thoughts and opinions I'm getting ready to share with you. Now, first things first, I like to get pretty in-depth in these videos, so if you don't want to watch the whole thing, skip around. It'll be segmented in the description below, but I'm going to go ahead and show you what comes in the box with this guy, and here is the optic itself. Now, this is kind of a recreation because obviously I have been using this now for about 3 months, so I can get my detailed thoughts and opinions to share with you guys. The reason I'm pointing that out is, unfortunately, I corrupted the unboxing footage I took at the very beginning of this review process. So when you receive this optic, the mount will be in this little empty cubby there. You can use it to store extra batteries if you so desire. The real bummer though is that this was a pretty interesting mount because it has some spring looking little piston systems there to help distribute the force so that your electronic components and thermal sensors don't see nearly as much of that shock from recoil, and I would guess they do that to help the longevity and reliability of this optic over time. It was a pretty interesting looking mechanism. If I can find it open source, then I'll overlay it here for you guys. But the reason I'm not taking it off is because these are some pretty small screws. I did Loctite them in, which is habit for me. Anytime I'm mounting something I don't plan on removing, such as hardware like this, I do Loctite it so it doesn't back out over time. I don't want to strip and ruin those screws to where I can't get the mount back on. So fortunately I can't show you that unless I can find some videos for you. So also in the case, you do have a nice little storage area. You have this interesting little USB Type C to USB Type B, I believe it is, B and C connection here. More on that to come. You do get a microfiber cleaning cloth, a screwdriver for the hardware, and you actually do get 4 extra screws, so 8 total were in the package. So you do have some spare hardware there, which is always nice, but if you're like me and you Loctite it, then it may not be of use to you in particular. Now, giving you a quick overview of the INFITAC Fast up close, on this left-hand side, you have this dial, which does serve as a selector because it can press in and toggle to get you through the menu system. Now, if you long press this, it'll turn on the red dot. Now, while that red dot's on, you can scroll if you're not in the menu, and it'll change from red to green. So you're gonna hear me say red dot a lot, but it does have a red and a green dot in the holographic housing. So you can choose your preference there. It's always nice, the options are always nice. On the rear, it's gonna be kind of close to like the holographic style window you're used to seeing, except you have some buttons on the back. Press and hold for power. This P button, if you press and hold, will change the thermal profiles. There are 4, I'll get into that later in the video. A short press will actually perform a nuke function to the sensor. Now, moving to the right-hand side, you have some simple adjustment screws for moving the red/green dot inside the holographic. You do have a digital reticle too on the inside. We'll get into that later in the video as far as how to zero that. Below that, you have your USB Type C connection for video out. You can also power it with a battery bank if you so desire. And then you have your actual CR123 batteries here with a nice little latch mechanism. One thing I did notice in terms of battery life is that if you drain it to the extent that you can no longer power the thermal sensor or the thermal core, you can still use the red dot. So it's kind of a nice built-in fail-safe that you're not totally dead. The actual red dot optic portion of this will still operate independent of the thermal core. So if you're ever in a pinch and you're really depending on an optic working, just know that you do get a little bit more out of it than just the thermal, which is nice. And up front is going to be your actual thermal sensor with a built-in rubber cover. So with batteries, the optic is coming in right around 684, it's on the teetering point grams. So definitely not the lightest weight, but in terms of build and feel, It feels incredibly durable, incredibly solid. Everything feels well made. So not something I think you have to baby. Feels like it's gonna hold up to pretty rigorous use. I mean, very solid. The aluminum housing doesn't feel thin and cheap. Overall, pretty pleasing to the hand. Fast in conjunction with the magnifier, but since it sits so high, you will have to use their proprietary mount. However, if you don't want to use their specific magnifier, maybe you already have like a G33, you'll notice that it actually shares the same footprint of most common magnifiers. So that's the good news there. It does have a nice QD system. This is a pretty common latch. It kind of looks like the American Defense style. A lot of magnifiers use that nice QD lever. So that shares some commonality there. So what scenarios is this good for? Like I said, it can be used as just a standard reflex sight. Granted, if you're intending to use it as that, you're spending way more money than you need to on this kind of optic, and it's a lot taller and bulkier than your average reflex sight would have otherwise been. However, if you use it in darker environments, or maybe you are a hunter, then the thermal capabilities really push this past the capabilities of a standard reflex sight. And of course, you can opt to use them in conjunction with each other, or you can isolate them from each other. You can go full thermal, full red dot, or the hybrid mode. Now, speaking of that, there is 4 different thermal profiles within this unit. There is what's kind of like an outline, so every other second it pretty much just traces around the hot spots in your environment. Now, those 2 modes are gonna work great with the built-in red dot. The next 2 modes is when you're using the full thermal sensor to completely cover the image inside of this optic. It has both a green hot and a black hot option, and it's kind of user preference on what looks better to your eye. I noticed that the contrast, if you make contrast adjustments on one, it doesn't necessarily look the best on the other. You kind of need to independently tweak contrast for the thermal profile that you want to go with. So again, just an observation there after using this for quite a while. But the big thing that I learned relatively quickly is that those first 2 modes where it draws the outline on your target or just fills in only the hot spot of your target, those are scaled properly when you're seeing your environment 1-to-1. It'll overlap great. Once you switch to the other 2 modes, that is the full thermal, those are no longer scaled to your environment, and that kind of confused me for a little bit because I was trying to zero the actual red dot to use with that, but I don't recommend doing that. It's not perfectly scaled. It seems like things get shrunk down a little bit, so your field of view is increased. But it gets a little trippy to your brain when you can see through this optic and see the real world and then see the thermal overlay. So my solution and my biggest recommendation to improve this is to have some kind of built-in cover for the optic itself when you want to use the full thermal mode, especially if you want to use that in the daytime where your environment's going to be bright, because it doesn't scale 1-to-1. It's going to throw you off. I put a piece of gaffer's tape over the front, which is a tape that's made to not leave a lot of residue behind. So you can see I don't have any gunk left on the objective lens here. And that let me, even in full daylight, I can then see the screen just fine and focus on what I needed to. There is a digital reticle that you can zero quite nicely. It's very convenient actually to get this thing zeroed with that. But I didn't realize that that's really intended for the 2 modes where it's the complete thermal view. So that'd be the biggest thing I want to point out. If you are picking this up, or maybe you already have one and it's throwing you off, that is the biggest thing I noticed. So depending on if you want to use it as a hybrid, that's really the first 2 modes. The other 2, it seems to me like they are to be the dedicated thermal modes, which was not clear to me in the manual. So now let's get into the capabilities of the actual thermal sensor. One test I like to do is test the dynamic range of the sensor. I simply aim it at my fireplace with the bag of ice next to it. Not a super useful test, but it kind of gives me an idea of how much data the sensor can grab. So you have something that's below the temperature of the freezing point of water and then well above it. So I wanted to see how much in between it could see or what it's going to crop out. Now it's very normal for thermal sensors in this category to completely crop out the direct fire region of the fireplace, and that's holds true for this. But I feel like a reasonable amount of data was retained and certainly should cover you for most of the ranges that you would need for practical use. Next, I wanted to try to see how good this thing does at distance in terms of detection, and we could see things several thousand yards away. It was picking it up. So in terms of sensitivity, this thing doesn't have an issue either. I can see footprints of my animals when they walk across the carpet. So a very quick and slight contact with something that is an insulator, not a conductor, the sensor does just fine. So sensitivity wise, this thing does not fall short, and it's overall pretty good. Okay, so let's get into my review portion of this video. I have been using this now for over 3 months. I've grown pretty comfortable with it. I've learned some of the quirks, and there's still some things that I, for the life of me, don't understand why it is the way it is. And I'm gonna share all that with you in this portion of the video so you can decide if this is the right optic for you or not. So first thing, let's talk about the video export capability and what I needed to do to share this sample footage with you guys, because this is probably my biggest complaint about this optic. It was a little disappointing. So you have this USB Type-C that they advertised for video exporting. Cool. They included this cable. This cable goes to a BNC. So, all right, neat. Not many BNC video recorders out there. Maybe there's a few, I could be wrong. So my first thought was to get this BNC to HDMI adapter. All right, so it's adapted to HDMI, therefore we need an HDMI cable. Okay, moving in the right direction, we're getting there. Neat. All right, now we have HDMI. That's a little bit more common use. So I could use this HDMI recorder that I invested in for the sake of this video. This cost me, I think, between $150 to $200. So these aren't necessarily cheap. But it is what I had to do to get you guys the sample footage. So we have this whole long train just to get to that capture box. All right, but you'll probably notice these aren't powered, so we need some more wires. I need to plug a power cable into the converter. So assume that these USB ends are going into a battery bank that I had to bring with me to the range. And then this guy has a kind of a crappy internal battery that dies fast, so I also went ahead and just plugged that in. So imagine I have a battery bank here. This is all the monstrosity that I had to bring along to the range on the bench rest just to record the video feed. So if you actually want to move around or go hunting, I don't think it's going to be very practical to record video. I just don't. They advertise video capture, and yes, you can capture video, but this is a really overcomplicated and tedious setup. But Kyle, why would you not just use USB Type-C to direct HDMI? Glad you asked. I tried that. I have that cable. I ordered that cable. I paid 20 bucks for this cable. It didn't work. This actually seemed kind of picky with the cable combinations I used. I could never get the HDMI feed on any of my camera monitors to blow it up bigger for me so I could see what I was recording for you at the range. Luckily, it did work with this field recorder here. So just know that was my experiences. Very complicated, didn't work with everything to get the video capture. Again, honest thoughts and opinions here on the channel. This is not a budget-oriented price point this is coming in at, and there are some competitors on the market, like such as HoloSun, I think coming in at less than half the cost, that have internal video recording and in a smaller footprint. So with all this extra housing space, it was disappointing to learn once I received this that this did not have internal video recording, and that would be one of the major improvements that I would suggest in the future, to make it more user-friendly, to where we can throw all this junk out of the way and all we need is this guy. Maybe a micro SD card slot, something of that nature. So we'll end on good notes, but there's one more complaint or nuance that I did discover here, and that is when you are, there's the 4 thermal modes. So one being outlining your target, where it kind of pulses in and out. It's really cool in person. I really enjoy that. It's really neat, honestly. The second is where it'll highlight your target and only your target, or the hot spot in your environment. Also very cool, very useful. So those 2 modes, I learned that that's really what should be used in conjunction with the red or green dot in the holographic housing. The reason for that is because once you switch to the full thermal modes, where it's the entire display and not just, you know, the hot spots in your environment, well, that display is not scaled perfectly to your environment. So when you're looking through this, it's gonna throw your brain off because you're seeing 2 images overlaid, and that red dot now is not really intended to be used with that. It took me a little bit to figure out that I was the problem maybe on that. But what I ended up doing is covering this front objective lens with the piece of gaffer tape. Gaffer tape, for those that don't realize, is tape that's not supposed to leave a bunch of residue behind. So it's something that I was comfortable, throwing on top of here. I don't put duct tape or something crazy on it because you're gonna put gunk all over your front lens. But that way it blocked the image to where I could only see the thermal display now. So some kind of rubber cover like this, or some kind of flip down cap or something that is opaque in front of this would solve that problem, to where when you only want to use the thermal mode, you're no longer getting the visual data that your eye is going to perceive of the environment in front of it. That was kind of a pain. Now, if you're using this at night in the dark, it's not an issue. So this is already good to go in really, really dark environments. But if you want to use it during the day or dusk hours, I recommend you get something to cover that. If you want to use the full thermal modes, obviously, if you want to use the hybrid mode, you need to see through this. That's where some kind of flip cover would be awesome. A drastically, a drastic improvement for this optic. So I can't end on bad notes. Let's talk about the good notes. Well, this is an electro-optic, meaning there's a lot of electronics on board and things can potentially fail or freeze. Zero issues. I never lost zero. It held zero just fine, and that's probably in part to their mount that has that nice recoil system that I unfortunately wasn't able to share with you. So it worked great in that regards. I didn't have any physical or mechanical failures other than just losing this rubber cover. For those that are worried about that, you can get little USB Type-C covers for computers and stuff to keep dust out that you could replug this. I keep a handful of them in your range bag in case they go missing. That's really the only thing that failed on this optic, although I won't really hold it against them. This happens to me all the time with rubber small parts. So that's all good there. There was zero firmware issues. Nothing froze, nothing stopped working, nothing failed to work. Once I fully understood how this optic was supposed to be used, especially with those two full dedicated thermal modes, zero issues whatsoever. It worked great. So reliability wasn't an issue. The battery life of 4 hours they advertised was pretty accurate. I didn't have anything prematurely die on me before that rough 4-hour ballpark using quality lithium batteries. And I was, for the most part, using it on mostly full brightness because I was out in the bright daylight using this optic. So all that was good. Everything that was advertised was true. And overall, it's a pretty interesting optic. All my friends that I've showed this in person have the same reaction, like, wow, that's crazy. Or, it's a really cool thing to see in person when you have that hybrid fusion technology over a red dot optical sight. Really neat, really cool to see that this is where the future's headed. Obviously things are gonna get smaller, lighter, more compact, better resolution over time. But this is kind of history in the making here, guys, when we see advancements in this direction, utilizing more than one technology. It's really, really cool. I'm here for it. And I'm glad you're here for it too. So on that note, I want to thank you for taking the time to stop by and watch the channel. And as always, guys, have a good one.